They say some sins die with the body. But what if the sin survives, passed on like a curse, wrapped in silence, buried in snow, waiting to be uncovered by the wrong question, asked at the wrong time? Tonight, inside the ancient walls of Griffin Hollow, a confession will unravel more than a murder. It will drag the living into the grave. The dead were never meant to leave. The wind that night didn't simply howl. It whispered like a dying confession, curling through the fractured stone bones of Elderglen Manor, as if the very house was breathing memories it was never meant to remember. Perched like a wounded sentinel on the cliffs of Hollowmere, the manor looked less like a home, and more like an accusation cast in shadow and granite, its towers leaning with the arrogance of a forgotten god, and its windows flickering with a light that didn't seem to come from fire, but something far colder. Inside, beneath the sweeping arches and blackened chandeliers of the great hall, the Feast of Ashes had begun, not with music, but with silence, the kind that weighs heavy on the skin. Every year, on this cursed night, the Ashcombe family performed their ritual of survival, dressing decay in velvet, silver and firelight, as if they could outdine the rot that was already in their bones. At the table sat Lord Alaric Ashcombe, a man carved from grief and iron, his face gaunt with the burden of holding a crumbling legacy together with nothing but pride and the fear of truth. To his right was his daughter Lenora, clutching her wine with trembling fingers, her smile as rigid as the corset cinched around her secrets. Beside her, Julian Ashcombe, the charming ward whose polished mannerisms veiled a predator's eyes, studied the room as if each guest were a chess piece edging toward checkmate. At the far end sat Reverend Thorne, ancient and shriveled, whispering Latin blessings that tasted like warnings. The table groaned beneath the weight of silver, too clean and food too untouched, and yet it was the empty chair near the hearth that held the room hostage, the one no one dared mention aloud, reserved each year for Silas Ashcombe, the prodigal brother who had vanished 5 winters ago amidst whispers of blood, madness and betrayal, never buried, never returned. Just as the old grandfather clock struck the first chime of midnight, thunder cracked the sky open like a wound, and the main doors, towering, iron-bound and thought-bolted, creaked open with the slowness of something deliberate, something not entirely human. A gust of rain-slicked air swept into the hall, extinguishing half the candles in a single breath, and from the darkened threshold stepped a figure soaked to the bone, wrapped in a long coat that clung like wet parchment, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing a face none of them had seen in years, but all had imagined differently in nightmares. "I trust I'm not too late for the feast." The voice rasped, dry, weathered and echoing with the kind of familiarity that made the spine forget how to stay straight. Lenora gasped. Julian stood so quickly his chair fell backward, and the Reverend's hand froze mid-blessing, fingers shaking as though they sensed something unholy. Lord Alaric did not rise. He simply stared, his face drained of all blood, as though he were watching not his brother, but the ghost of a debt he had buried alive. The wind moaned through the windows like a child abandoned, the shadows along the ceiling bent as if listening, and in that suspended moment between silence and scream, Elderglen Manor felt no longer like a house but a tomb, and the Feast of Ashes had become something far darker, a ritual of reckoning in which none were guests, and all were offerings. Mrs. Winifred Hale moved like a whisper between shadows, the hem of her dark skirt barely disturbing the stillness that cloaked the dining chamber of Blackfen Hollow, where ancient portraits stared down from smoke-darkened walls with expressions carved more from memory than oil. As she refilled each trembling crystal goblet, her hand steady despite the tension that coiled through the air like a serpent, she paused only at the mention of Lord Leonard's absence, an omission that now hung over the room, not as a matter of etiquette, but as an omen. "In my experience," she murmured, her voice like the hush before a storm, "people's motives are always simpler than they claim, and far more dangerous than they understand." Her words were not opinion but conviction, sharpened by decades spent tending to a house that wore its tragedies like secrets sewn into the drapes. At the far end of the long table, Father Adlai, a small, inconspicuous figure in threadbare black, lifted his head and offered a knowing smile, the kind that didn't quite reach the eyes. "Wisdom won by bruises," he said gently, "not by books." But before Mrs. Hale could reply, Julian Hargrave, the heir with a future as uncertain as his inheritance, checked his silver watch with visible agitation. "It's nearly 10, he said sharply, not bothering to conceal his frustration. "If Uncle Leonard expects us to preserve tradition in his absence, he is mistaken. I've matters to raise with him, matters concerning deeds, holdings and future obligations that no superstition should delay." "Business on 12th night," came the drawling voice of Victor Greystone, who leaned back in his seat with the confidence of a man who had long ceased to be polite. "How refreshingly unholy of you, Mr. Hargrave. I thought tonight belonged to ghosts and God." "Everything bows to necessity," Julian snapped, his eyes flashing. "We can pretend otherwise if you like, but truth doesn't change because we dress it in lace." At that, even the fire seemed to shrink back, flames hissing low as the old lord of the house, Percival Hargrave, rose from his chair with the kind of slow ceremonial motion one uses to greet the dead. "Enough," he said, his voice etched with the weight of unspoken regrets. "I will fetch Leonard myself. The feast must begin. The family must stand complete, or not at all." But as he turned, he stopped cold, his body stilled mid-step, eyes wide with a strange unease, like a man who had just stepped into a dream where something impossible waits behind the door he's already opened. The wind outside had ceased, but in that silence a deeper sound pulsed, an absence that felt like presence, a breath being held by the walls themselves. Father Adlai turned his full attention to the Lord, his soft voice now iron beneath wool. "Tradition," he said, "is not only memory, it is cost. And it may be we are asked to pay more than we ever understood." The atmosphere was thick now, like a room submerged, and no one spoke as they followed Lord Percival into the corridor where portraits whispered behind their varnish and cold marble floors reflected not footsteps but hesitation. The next morning came not as salvation, but as slow revelation, pale dawn bleeding across the moor like a wound refusing to clot. Snow had fallen in the night, not gently, but with the finality of something covering a crime, rendering hedgerows and garden paths into indistinguishable blanks. Percival stood before the frost-laced windows, face pale with the exhaustion of a man who had not slept because sleep would have demanded he stop fearing. Mrs. Hale entered. More ghost than servant now, her voice even lower than before. "The chapel," she whispered. "We've not looked there. He spent hours there lately, in silence, in prayer, in thought. Thinking," muttered Greystone, stepping out from the parlor like an accusation in human form. "Dangerous business, especially for men with too much guilt and not enough distraction." In the distance, the chapel's bell, long unused, gave a single hollow toll, though no rope had been pulled, and in that sound was something ancient and unfinished, something that did not simply call the living but warned them. "Conscience," Father Elric murmured, his voice soft but cutting through the chill air like a whisper meant for the dead. "It has a way of unsettling the contented, of disturbing what was never truly at peace." His words, gentle yet weighty, seemed to echo off the frost-bitten stone of Hollowmere Abbey's courtyard, where snowflakes swirled like forgotten prayers falling from a silent sky. As the group made their way toward the chapel, their footsteps crunched against the snow-covered path, the air between them thick with unspoken fears. There was a stillness in the atmosphere, not the calm of tranquility, but the taut hush that precedes a revelation too terrible to name. Lord Augustin led the way, his posture rigid, as though carrying the accumulated sins of generations. His face was set in stone, unreadable, save for the flicker in his eyes, fear, or perhaps recognition of a reckoning long delayed. Behind him, Marcus Vale, his nephew, walked with an impatience born of youthful arrogance, eager to dismiss what he could not immediately explain. Penrose Quinn, the journalist, moved with a predator's grace, notebook in hand, already sketching the headlines that might follow. Professor Aldous Crane trudged along with nervous glances, as if the very air were laced with ghosts, while Alara Morn, the housekeeper, marched ahead with the grim determination of someone who had already begun mourning. At the rear of the procession was Father Elric himself, gliding silently through the snow like a man led not by footsteps, but by the weight of foreknowledge. The chapel of St. Icarian stood at the cliff's edge, like a relic from another age, its walls hunched beneath the snow, its stained glass windows half shrouded by frost. The building had once been a sacred space, echoing with weddings, funerals, and whispered confessions. Now it seemed merely haunted, a tomb not just of bones but of memory. Elric halted at the threshold, her voice barely a breath. "He never leaves the chapel door open," she said, her eyes fixed on the darkened gap between stone and wood. "Brother Elric always said, some things from outside must be kept out, and some things from within." Marcus pushed the door open with a hesitant shove. The heavy oak creaked like a coffin lid disturbed. Inside, candlelight flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the pews, and there, laid out before the altar, was Brother Elric. His body was positioned with eerie precision, arms folded over his chest, rosary beads entwined in his fingers, eyes closed as though in sleep. But peace was only a mask. Laid atop his chest was a slab of blackened rye bread, and beside it, a mound of coarse red salt, dark, clotted as though soaked in blood. Around his neck, just visible beneath his collar, was a bruised line, thin, precise, and damning. Professor Crane stumbled back, his face pale. "By God, this is the exacramentum, the forbidden rite, sin-cleansing through sacrifice." Elric crossed herself, but her whispered prayer cracked in the cold air. "That rite died centuries ago. It's blasphemy. It's madness." Penrose leaned in, eyes sharp. "Or belief," he muttered. "Belief sharpened into a blade." Marcus shook his head. panic rising in his voice. He must have done this himself, some twisted ritual, atonement for sins he could no longer confess. Father Elric interrupted softly, kneeling by the body. That's not how the exacramentum works. The bread and salt are consumed by the witness, the sin-bearer, not the deceased. This was done to him, not by him. The candle nearest the altar guttered suddenly, as if in response. Father Elric's fingers moved gently, reverently, lifting the crust of bread. Beneath it, hidden in the folds of Alaric's robes, was a slip of parchment, vellum, stained and torn, scrawled in Latin, that bled like ink made from veins. Et nondum redemptus est. And yet he is not redeemed. A gust of wind howled through the chapel door, slamming it shut with such force that even Lord Augustin flinched. Every eye turned to the parchment, and then to Father Elric, who stared at it not with shock, but with understanding. This, he said quietly, is not the end of a ritual. It's the beginning of a debt being claimed. Marcus backed away. This is absurd. Old legends, monkish ghost stories. But Penrose stepped forward, his voice lower now. Then why the salt? Why the bread? Why the bruising on the neck? This wasn't penance, this was punishment. Elric's hands trembled. He told me he'd been having dreams, she whispered, that someone was watching him in the chapel, that the sins of the family were waking again. I thought he was just tired, but maybe. She didn't finish. Father Elric rose slowly. Some sins, he said, cling to bloodlines. They don't die, they wait, and someone in this house knew the old ways well enough to invoke them. But sin-eating doesn't erase guilt, it binds it. He turned to Augustin, to Marcus, to Crane. The question now is not who killed Brother Elric, but whose sins he died for, and whether that debt has truly ended, or if something older, more patient, is still collecting. The snow fell in near silence, a steady curtain of white that turned the chapel of Calethorn Hollow into something that resembled neither a holy site nor a crime scene, but a tomb, timeless, watchful, and weighed down by memory. Its towering grey stones exhaled a chill not just of temperature, but of time. Centuries of whispered confessions, ancestral secrets, and ritualistic whispers clung to the mortar like dried blood. The building was meant to inspire solace, but in the wake of High Deacon Merrow's death, it felt more like a sanctum of guilt. Inspector Venn stood in the doorway, not yet entering, as if some instinct warned him that stepping beyond the threshold meant stepping into something old and watching. The others had left quickly, Lady Ashcroft trembling behind her veil, the groundskeeper muttering about broken vows, and Father Giles with his collar askew and his eyes too wide. Only Venn remained, his mind already piecing together threads the others dared not touch. His boots crunched over frost-slick flagstones as he moved deeper into the nave, his sharp eyes noting everything, the untouched altar candles still dripping wax, the scattered traces of ash formed into what at first glance appeared to be religious symbols, but upon closer inspection hinted at something darker, something coded. The altar itself was strangely clean, polished even, as though someone had tried to wipe it of fingerprints while preserving the ritualistic display. On the stone step where the deacon had been found hours ago, arms folded, face peaceful in death, remained a circle of coarse bread, a feather singed at the edge, and a mound of salt shaped into the eye of Providence. But Venn's attention was caught by something subtler, the faint impressions left by knees on the prayer cushions, 2 sets, not one, and both recent. This was not the work of a lone supplicant lost in superstition. No, this was theatre. Every element, positioning, lighting, the way the bread had been darkened as if aged yet smelled freshly baked, suggested calculation. Venn had seen this kind of misdirection before. Killers who masked motive beneath myth, who buried truth beneath the poetry of ritual. As he walked past the old stained-glass windows, their fractured light casting red and gold across his face, he paused beneath the mural at the altar wall, a depiction of the carrying of the burdens, a forgotten rite in which chosen family members symbolically absorbed the sins of others. In Merrow's case, however, no symbolism could explain the deep bruising found on his throat, or the old mark burned faintly into his chest, a sigil resembling a reversed cross pierced by a thorned vine. Drawn toward the confessional booth tucked into the shadows of the chapel's eastern wall, Venn hesitated before reaching for the heavy wooden door. It creaked open with the sound of something ancient being disturbed. The scent inside hit him instantly. Beeswax, old breath, and the bitter tang of something metallic. It was empty, but the thin velvet curtain on the penitent's side fluttered as if recently disturbed, and upon the shelf lay a folded parchment, brittle at the edges but sealed with a wax emblem that matched the sigil on the deacon's chest. Breaking the seal with his penknife, Venn read the single line written in a looping, archaic script. I spoke what was not mine and bore what none should. Forgive the one who remains. It wasn't a confession. It was a transfer, a handing off. And then as he stepped back, the faint sound of bells reached him, not chapel bells but something higher pitched and irregular, from the bell tower above, a place supposedly locked for years. He looked up, breath caught in his throat, and for the briefest moment he saw a shadow move across the lattice opening, too quick for certainty, but too real for coincidence. He exited the confessional slowly, eyes scanning every corner now with a new awareness, his instincts telling him that what had taken place here wasn't finished, that the killer hadn't fled but waited. Perhaps not here in body, but in intention. The spiral pattern now forming in the ashes had changed yet again, no longer symmetrical, now jagged, fractal, as if replicating an internal madness. Venn stood alone in the center of the chapel, the weight of centuries bearing down on his shoulders, and for the first time in his long career, he felt the walls themselves lean closer. Outside, the snowfall thickened, covering footprints, obscuring paths, and slowly sealing off Calethorn Hollow from the outside world, like a forgotten chapter being erased before it could be read. What disturbed him most wasn't the murder, nor the ritual, but the sense that the deacon's death had merely opened a door, one that wasn't supposed to be opened, and someone, or something, was still inside. The confession box, once a silent witness to whispered absolutions, now stood like an open wound in the heart of the ancient chapel, its wooden frame bearing not the weight of forgiveness, but the desperate etchings of someone cornered by conscience and time. The scratches were not wild or random, but chiseled with panicked intent, each groove a tremble, a scream turned silent by fear. And there, beneath the frantic surface, words emerged, fragmented yet piercing in their clarity. Beneficiary listed, Whitestone Trust for War Widows, ledger notes discrepancy, ask Hargrove. The message, half a confession and half a warning, ended abruptly, cut off by either interruption or the collapse of the carver's resolve. Inspector Merrick leaned in, lips tight, reading the lines as though deciphering scripture carved by a ghost. His breath hung in the cold air as the weight of the message settled heavily into the space around him. But before he could process its implications, a familiar presence filled the chapel's threshold. Simon Drexley, the relentless investigative journalist, his silhouette framed by the fading light, notebook already poised like a blade. "Never underestimate a guilty man's craving for a clean conscience," he said dryly, approaching the box with reverent curiosity. "They always leave breadcrumbs, enough to find their way back, or enough for someone else to follow the trail." Merrick didn't look up, or enough to be found only after it's too late. Drexley traced the carved words with the tip of his glove. Whitestone Trust. I've seen that name buried in audit records from '43. It was supposed to support the widows of factory workers lost during the Blitz, but the money dried up mysteriously. The trustees went silent, it disappeared from public memory, and no one had the stomach to keep asking questions once the medals were being handed out. Merrick finally turned toward him. "You think this has something to do with the Reverend's death?" "I think," Drexley said slowly, "that guilt eats men slower than poison, but just as fatally." Their exchange was interrupted by the sharp clack of heels against the flagstone floor. Eleanor Langford, her face pale with tension, entered like someone walking into a battlefield, her composure wrapped tightly around her like funeral silk. She hesitated when she saw them near the confession box, her gaze locking on the gouged wood before she looked away, voice clipped. "Lord Halcroft requests your presence in the study. Tea is being served, and the coroner's report has just arrived. He would like us all present when the inspector gives his findings." "Of course," Drexley muttered, snapping his notebook shut. "No better pairing than black tea and cold corpses." Eleanor's eyes flashed. "This isn't a game, Mr. Drexley." "Then stop playing it like one," he replied without venom, but with something colder, certainty. Merrick watched her closely. Her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them, a tremor she tried to hide by clutching her shawl tighter. "Miss Langford," he said gently, "did the Reverend ever speak to you about the trust?" She shook her head, but too quickly, too defensively. He was obsessed with the past. Spoke of redemption, of hidden sins. He believed the church had failed to ask the right questions when it mattered most. He never said what those questions were. Merrick moved to the small desk where Reverend Albridge used to sit in solitary reflection, lit only by a tarnished brass candle holder. Beneath a stack of sermons, he found a folder marked personal, its contents carefully arranged, annotated wartime financial statements, letters between the trustees of the Whitestone Trust, and a photograph showing Lord Halcroft in military uniform standing beside a man labelled simply as E.H. Hargrove. There were no accusations, only trails, clues left behind like echoes in a chamber where truth had been buried under years of silence. He was conducting an audit, Merrick said quietly, one the family never wanted reopened. Eleanor's composure finally cracked. Her voice lowered nearly a whisper. "He couldn't let it go. Said God would never forgive us if we pretended the books were closed." "Sometimes," Drexley added, his voice barely above the wind whispering through the chapel. "Truth knocks politely. Sometimes it carves its name into wood." A heavy silence followed, filled only by the distant ticking of the chapel's ancient wall clock. Merrick looked again at the confession box. How its damage framed the words like a tombstone inscription. Outside, The snow was falling again, in slow deliberate spirals, coating the world in a white hush, as if nature itself were aiding the cover-up, erasing footsteps, closing pages, sealing lips. But within these stone walls, something had already broken open. A story long silenced was stirring again, clawing back from the grave, demanding to be heard. There are silences that do not simply linger, they endure like ghosts chained to memory, pressing against the walls of old houses and older hearts. Renmore Hall was filled with such silences. As dusk settled over the estate like a velvet shroud, its windows glowed warmly against the cold, yet within, an entirely different temperature ruled. In the high-ceilinged library, where portraits of dead ancestors watched with unreadable eyes, Amelia Hargrave stood in the hush, her hands clutched tightly at her apron, white-knuckled and unmoving. The air was dry with the scent of dust, aged leather and secrets long confined to ink and memory. Her voice, when it broke the quiet, was low and brittle. "Some of us lost more than what could be written in ledgers," she whispered. "Some losses bled deeper, and never stopped." Father Ellis turned his gaze toward her, sensing that her grief had not dulled with time, it had sharpened into something heavier, something forged by quiet betrayals and memory's denied voice. "Loss," he said slowly, "wears many masks. Sometimes it hides in duty, sometimes in silence, but there comes a point when it no longer mourns, it demands retribution." Amelia's lips pressed into a line, not in disagreement but in deep, buried acknowledgement. Her eyes, heavy with unshed tears, flicked briefly toward the doorway, as though fearing someone might overhear what should not have been said. Before she could respond, the door opened slowly, and in walked Edgar Linley, the antiquarian bookseller. His thin frame bowed under invisible burdens. His face was ghostly pale, and his fingers trembled as he adjusted his scarf. "Father," he began, his voice unsteady, "I fear I may have contributed unwittingly to Mr. Julian's unrest." The priest turned to him with quiet patience. "How so, Mr. Linley?" Edgar swallowed. "He sought books from me. Not just theology, though there was plenty of that, but also texts on ritual purification, ancestral debts, sacrificial recompense, even medieval forms of penance once outlawed by the church." He paused, visibly shaken. He believed the land itself remembered, that there were sins buried beneath the foundations of this house, and that confession, public, irrevocable, was the only path forward. Was he planning to expose something specific? Ellis asked. Edgar glanced at Amelia, who had gone still as stone. He spoke of financial records from the war years, hidden transfers, funds meant for widows and veterans that never arrived. He was obsessed with the idea that silence had become complicity, that the name Farrar meant nothing if it was built on stolen virtue. Amelia exhaled, sharp and shallow. "Julian was a good man," she said. "Too good." He still believed truth could heal what power had learned to survive. Her words held no warmth, only sorrow and quiet fury. "But conscience," she added, her voice like cut glass, "isn't always a balm. Sometimes it's a blade, and not everyone is willing to bleed for it." Father Ellis noted the shifting expressions on her face. Anger, guilt, something close to fear. Before he could speak again, Inspector Hale entered the room, flanked by a constable. His presence, tall and deliberate, cast a shadow that seemed to dim the very firelight. "We've confirmed the time of death," he said plainly. "Between 11 and 3, death by strangulation, no signs of forced entry, but the ritual markings, those were intentional. Someone staged it to look like old folklore. Sin-eating, scapegoating, but this was modern, calculated. Someone wanted to mislead us." Ellis turned toward the window, watching the snow begin to fall again across the courtyard. He was preparing to make everything public, to drag the rot out into the light. His voice was barely above a murmur, "And someone killed him for it, not because he was wrong, but because he was right." Behind him, Amelia's breath caught, and for the briefest moment, she seemed to fold in on herself, as though the truth were too heavy to carry, and too dangerous to put down. The silence that followed was not empty, it was waiting. Somewhere within these walls, someone knew the full cost of that confession, and they were praying it would stay buried. Nathaniel Crowley sat rigidly in the high-backed leather chair, his knuckles bone-white as they gripped a worn folio, its corners frayed like secrets too long handled. Across from him, Inspector Hawthorne waited in measured silence, his pencil motionless over his open notebook, as if sensing that the moment called not for interrogation, but for confession. "Inspector," Nathaniel began, his voice brittle with a weight he had carried alone, "I feel compelled to reveal something I should have spoken of long ago, but fear, as you know, can be a better jailer than iron." A slow, uncertain breath followed. "My dealings with the late Lord Ashcombe weren't limited to the trade of books. For nearly a year he'd been purchasing volumes esoteric theology, yes, but also more troubling ones, works on inherited guilt, restitution rituals, moral debts carried across generations. He believed sin was like blood, it stained all it touched, even in silence, By the window, young Dorian Ashcombe, heir to the estate, and dressed in brittle arrogance, turned sharply. Nonsense, my uncle was devout, not deranged. What sins could he possibly have imagined he bore? That, Master Dorian, Nathaniel said, was precisely his torment. He believed the estate, your family, had, during the war, diverted funds earmarked for rebuilding the soldiers' infirmary, channeling them instead into private accounts that kept Ashcombe Manor from collapse. He was preparing to speak out. He said that silence in the face of such betrayal was not just cowardice, it was complicity. At this, the room's temperature seemed to fall. Lady Ashcombe, still and silent until now, placed her teacup down with a soft clink that echoed too loudly in the thick stillness. Her face, porcelain pale, gave nothing away, but her hand trembled. He intended to name names, Nathaniel continued. He had uncovered transfers, dates, signatures. He believed soldiers who had returned broken, expecting sanctuary, had been sold into neglect to keep these halls warm. From the fireplace, the steward, old Harland, suddenly stirred, his eyes glinting. My brother, he rasped, was one of them, promised care, turned away. He died on the roadside, coughing blood in November's cold while this house drank from gold-rimmed goblets. A silence followed that seemed to warp the air, pressing inward. Enough, Dorian barked, stepping forward, his voice loud and false. This is slander. Grief speaking without reason. But even as he said it, the room betrayed him. Lady Ashcombe's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and Harland's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Hawthorne watched them all. When guilt is buried long enough, he said softly, it grows teeth, and though no one spoke further, all knew. Something had been unearthed that could no longer be reburied without consequence. The air in the drawing-room of Greystone Hollow felt thicker now, not with smoke or winter's chill, but with the collective tension of truths pressing at the edges of silence, begging to be heard. Alaric Merrow stood near the mantel, his knuckles white around a brass fire poker, as if the flickering embers might offer defense against the storm of revelation gathering around him. Across from him, Father Merrin sat with the composed stillness of a man trained to listen beyond words, his gaze never leaving Alaric's trembling jaw. You said you came to your uncle with urgent business, Merrin prompted softly. Was it truly only documents for land sales, or was it something you hoped to prevent? Alaric opened his mouth, but it was Eloam Blythe who spoke first, the sharp steel of her tone cutting clean through the fog of evasion. You feared what your uncle was about to say. A confession, wasn't it? One that would have dragged your family's name through the mud and gutted every pound of inherited privilege from under your feet. Alaric's throat worked, but he said nothing. Because scandal, Alaric continued mercilessly, ruins more than reputations, it kills legacies. And this estate, propped up by stolen promises and the silence of the desperate, would not survive the truth. In the corner, Miss Adele Hart rose slowly, her hands clutching the arms of the chair as if steadying herself against waves of memory. My brother, Marcus, she began, voice cracked and hollow, came home from the Western Front with a body no longer his own. They told him, there was sanctuary waiting at Northmoor, that the manor had made space for veterans with funds set aside to ease their final days. But we waited, and all we got were unsigned letters and lies. He died in a slum infirmary, screaming in the dark, while these floors were waxed with wine and candlelight. Her words hung in the room like smoke, suffocating. Lord Cedric, cheeks pale as bone, cleared his throat. We never intended harm, he said, voice soft but brittle. The country was starving, the estate drowning in debt. We used funds marked for temporary redistribution, always with the plan to return them once the harvests turned. Intent does not undo death, Elowen said, her eyes glinting with the fire of something older than rage. Justice long denied, and your brother, your sainted Godfrey, finally found the courage to call your sins by their true name. Merrin leaned forward. When was he planning to confess? All eyes turned now to Marjorie Crane, the widow whose voice barely rose above the crackling fire. He told me, she whispered, he had chosen epiphany. He believed that if the day marked revelation for Christ, then it should do the same for man. He said it was time to wash the blood from the manor's hands. A shiver passed through the room, not from the cold but from the brutal precision of timing. Father Merrin stood slowly. Then someone silenced him, he said, his voice grave. Someone who feared not just disgrace but ruin, and they cloaked it in symbols, rituals to mislead. But at its core this wasn't about mysticism or madness, it was about desperation and guilt. A moment passed where no one breathed. Even the walls lined with oil portraits of long-dead ancestors seemed to lean forward in judgment. So the question now, Merrin concluded, is not who had reason. Everyone in this room has bled by that blade. The question is who had the will, the darkness inside strong enough to turn fear into action and silence a man on the brink of truth. He stepped to the window where dusk had finally devoured the last light from the snow-laden gardens, and he stared into the gathering shadows. The answer lies not in the chapel or the ledger, not in dust or ink. It lies within the soul that believed one more secret could hold back the flood, and that soul, he added, his voice nearly a whisper, is still among us. The room had the stillness of a tomb recently disturbed, not by violence but by memory unearthed. Its air carried a strange mix of dust, regret and candle wax, as if the space had once belonged to a man of privilege, but had since become a shrine to repentance. Where polished mahogany and sporting prints had once adorned the walls, now stood shelves sagging under the weight of theological volumes, ink-streaked notebooks and brittle parish leaflets detailing obscure rituals of redemption. It was not just a study, it was the autopsy of a soul in turmoil. Inspector Alton peered closely at a worn leather-bound text on ascetic purification and muttered. He read this obsessively, the margins aligned with questions, many underlined twice. It's as though he was preparing or bracing himself. Father Elias, quiet till now, took the book, and as he opened it a folded parchment slipped free like a fallen feather. It drifted to the stone floor, revealing inked lines in a hand too steady to be casual, poetic stanzas woven from fragments of folklore. "It's not scripture," Elias murmured, "but it reads like liturgy. Listen, salt for the sin, bread for the bone, lay them close when the soul is gone. The eater comes with veiled face near to silence guilt and swallow fear." The words hung heavy, and in that silence Mrs. Calder, the late caretaker's niece, let her duster fall limp in her hands. "That's from an old borderland rhyme," she said, voice tight as thread. "My great-aunt used to hum it when she lit candles for the dying, said it kept the dark ones out." Elias looked at her. Did she believe in the Signeata? Calder hesitated. She was one, or that's what folks whispered, said she was paid in meat and coin to sit by the corpses and take their last sins through ritual, eat the bread, salt the tongue, recite the prayer. After that she was never the same. Alton turned to a pile of Godfrey Harrow's private correspondence and drew out a receipt from a local antiquarian bookseller, an entire order of volumes on funerary rites, transfernets myths, and pagan absolution ceremonies. He wasn't just researching this, Alton said grimly, he was reconstructing it. At that, journalist Lyle Benton straightened with a grin as sharp as glass. So he stage-managed his own murder as a symbolic atonement. Brilliant. The man turned suicide into theatre. Or, Father Elias said softly, someone turned his guilt into a weapon. This isn't performance, Mr. Benton. It's faith corrupted into choreography. A killer used the symbols he feared most, arranged his death like a ritual he couldn't escape. Alton crouched, studying the parchment again. Some lines are darker, ink fresher, parts added later. Elias nodded. Guilt evolves. He may have started with poetry and ended with prophecy. This line here, the eater walks not in shadow but in borrowed light. That's not tradition, that's insight. That's someone realizing the person meant to cleanse him might become his executioner. Silence returned, deeper now, wrapping itself around the cold stone walls and the lingering incense of confession long delayed. "Whoever did this," Elias murmured, stepping toward the shuttered window as twilight smudged the horizon into ash and charcoal, knew that Godfrey Harrow was desperate for absolution. They gave him what he feared most, a final sacrament written in salt, blood and silence. The chamber smelled of smoke and sanctity, as though the very walls had absorbed the breath of rituals long since outlawed. It was once the private study of Professor Lucian Hargrave, a respected scholar of comparative theology, but now it resembled the aftermath of an exorcism. Furniture had been pushed aside with the haste of desperation, and in the center of the room, a large ash circle dominated the warped wooden floorboards. Scorched into its perimeter were runes so ancient, even Father Alaric had to squint to recognize them. Surrounding the circle lay fragments of candles, melted into shapes like broken teeth, and pages torn from illuminated manuscripts, each smeared with ink, blood or something between the two. It was not merely a crime scene. It was the echo of something older, darker, a ritual left unfinished. Inspector Langley, who had seen his share of both murder and madness, held up a notebook retrieved from the desk, a leather-bound volume with pages so filled with marginalia they resembled webs spun in ink. "These aren't just research notes," he muttered, flipping through trembling lines. "They're confessions, questions maybe, or warnings." His eyes landed on a repeated phrase, written in increasingly erratic script. "If I take his sin, will he take my peace?" Father Alaric stood by the cold hearth, gazing at the untouched plate of bread and the small silver bowl of salt placed beside the professor's chest. "The elements are all here," he whispered, "but they're untouched. The ritual wasn't completed, or perhaps wasn't meant to be." Gracie Renfield, Lucian's assistant and ward, lingered near the doorway, her face pale and blank like unprocessed grief. "He believed sin had weight," she said softly, "that it could be measured, transferred." The idea consumed him. He started talking about the Eater's Canticle as if it were more than folklore, as if it were an equation, a divine loophole. Her voice faltered as she looked at the ashes that had stained the professor's fingers in death. "I didn't think he would actually try it." Langley turned sharply, holding out a scorched envelope retrieved from the bottom drawer. "Then how do you explain this?" Inside was a single page, Lucian's handwriting, now frantic and faded. "If it works, I am free. If it fails, may the reader forgive what I became." A moment of stunned silence followed, broken only by the distant groan of the old house settling deeper into itself. Alaric stepped toward the ritual circle with deliberate care, eyes narrowing as he took in its symmetry. "Someone helped him," he said. "He couldn't have etched these sigils alone, not while weakening from fasting and penance." He gestured toward the scattered remnants of dried herbs and hollow bone flutes, items used in rituals far older than Christianity. Whoever assisted him knew the tradition. But something's wrong. The execution is flawed. It mimics the rite but doesn't honor it. Gracie looked away, biting her lip until it bled. "I wanted to help him. I truly did. But when the moment came, I couldn't. I watched him lie down in that circle and close his eyes like it was sleep. But it wasn't sleep." Langley's face hardened. "So you left him there to die?" But Alaric interrupted calmly. "No, Inspector. She left him at the edge of belief. The actual transference never occurred. The bread and salt remain uneaten, which means the guilt he hoped to surrender is still waiting for someone to carry it." The room chilled perceptibly. Wind hissed through the cracked window panes and the candle stubs flickered as though exhaling breath not their own. No one noticed the single raven feather that had blown in, or the strange indentation in the ash circle, like something had knelt within it after Hargrave had already passed. Then something else surfaced, something darker. In the corner, half hidden beneath a stack of arcane books, was a small voice recorder. When played, it revealed Lucian's final words, barely audible. "He promised me. He said I wouldn't remember the pain, that I would sleep, and someone else would wake in my place. But I'm still here. I'm still—" The audio cut out with a mechanical click. Gracie screamed and stumbled back. Langley snapped the device off, his expression unreadable. "This wasn't an act of mercy," he muttered. "It was a ritual staged for a witness, someone who needed to believe it failed, when it may have succeeded in ways we can't yet understand." Alaric slowly turned to face the armoire, where the investigator earlier found black candles, ancient coins and pages written in mirrored Latin. "There's someone else," he said quietly. "Someone who knew this rite by heart, who copied it again and again, not to record but to memorize, like an actor rehearsing for a performance where the role is damnation." He walked toward the armoire and opened the false bottom. Inside, scrawled in trembling charcoal, were the words, "I ate so he could rest, but he won't stop screaming." Langley went still. "You're saying someone completed the ritual after he died?" Alaric shook his head. "Or that someone else began it, and now walks this house with a soul not entirely their own." Outside, thunder rolled across Griffin Hill as night descended. The shadows in the hallway grew longer, curling up the walls like something alive. Somewhere in the darkness, something watched. The ritual may have failed in part, but something had been stirred. And now, as the wind howled through the bones of the house, Father Alaric whispered the final truth none of them wanted to face. This was never about release, it was about resurrection. And something came back. The fading afternoon light slanted through the tall mullioned windows of Westmere Hall's drawing room, catching on the threads of age-old lace curtains and painting long, accusing shadows across the walls. But it wasn't just the sun that exposed them that day. It was something older, darker and far more patient, truth. The kind of truth that waits in silence for decades, coiled beneath carpets and tucked inside desk drawers, until one day it demands to be heard. Inspector Lewin stood like a sentinel before the fireplace, the crackle of the flames the only sound for a long, breathless moment. Before him lay a series of files, maps, folded letters and hospital rosters yellowed with age, each one a fragment of a story no one wanted retold. "The St. Albans Convalescent Trust," he began, his voice clipped and clinical, "was established in 1916. Its mission, at least on paper, was noble, to provide long-term care for veterans of the Great War. It was funded generously by Warwickshire's wealthiest families, including, most prominently, the Alcott estate." A ripple passed through the room. Lord Alcott, seated like a sculpture in his high-backed chair, flinched so subtly it might have gone unnoticed, except everyone was watching him. "A gesture of patriotism," he muttered at last, his gaze fixed on nothing. "The estate was under siege, men were dying in the trenches, and here everything we built was crumbling. So you used the charity to protect your legacy," Lewin said, his voice gentler now, but no less cutting. 6,200 fonts siphoned off under false maintenance claims, architectural surveys that never occurred, and renovations that lined your drawing room in mahogany while men coughed themselves to death in Birmingham alleys. Lady Rosamond gasped softly, a gloved hand rising to her lips. The logs in the fireplace snapped sharply, as though reacting to the accusation. Miss Elspeth Harrow, keeper of the estate's records, paled visibly, her jaw twitching. Her hands trembled as she reached to set the silver tea tray back onto the sideboard, and then suddenly, it slipped. The crash echoed through the room like a rifle shot. No one moved. "My brother was meant to go there," she whispered at last, her voice cracked with old wounds. "He came home from Cambrai blind in one eye, and with shrapnel along his spine. He was promised a place. He waited. He wrote letters. Then he stopped writing altogether. They buried him in an unmarked grave behind a city ward. The silence that followed was suffocating." Young Oliver Alcott shifted uneasily, the colour draining from his face. "I didn't know," he offered weakly, looking to his father, to the inspector, to the old walls that had kept so much silence for so long. "I was just a child." "You were meant to be," Elspeth said sharply, the fire in her voice unexpected. "Your family built a wall of silence around you, but not everyone had the luxury of forgetting." Father Hale, seated near the hearth, closed his worn prayer book slowly, his voice soft. "The weight of sin doesn't vanish with time. It becomes heavier. It embeds itself in the soul of the place, of its people." Inspector Lewin resumed, now lifting a folded letter marked confidential. "Dr. Ambrose Greaves began his research into veteran care records for the War Memorial just last year. What he found didn't match the public archives, names missing, dates altered. When he tried to confront Lord Alcott, he drowned within days, found face down near the mill, no bruises, no struggle, declared accidental. But the tides don't drag bodies upstream." The fire popped, the flames seemed to lean closer, a groan came from the hallway, an old pipe, or something more ghostly. Then came a voice from the far doorway. He wasn't the only one. Every head turned. It was Lady Rosamond. Her hands clutched the doorframe as though it might collapse. Her voice was frayed with memory. "My husband, Nathaniel. He found the same ledgers in 1924. He confronted your father, Oliver. Within months he fell from his study balcony. They called it a drunken accident, but he hadn't touched drink since the Somme." Inspector Lewin turned to face the youngest Alcott, who now looked as though he'd aged a decade in moments. "Your inheritance," he said, "is built on stolen breath and betrayed promises." But it was the softest voice in the room that shattered everything. Mr. Fielding, the estate's frail and faithful valet, stepped forward with difficulty, holding a wrapped bundle to his chest. "Sir," he said to Oliver, "this belonged to your father, his war journal. He wrote everything. Not for guilt, I think, but so someone would remember the truth one day." He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a leather-bound diary so worn its edges curled like dried petals. "I kept it hidden all these years," Fielding whispered, "because I couldn't bear to look at it. But now," he faltered, "I can't carry it anymore." Oliver reached for the journal with shaking hands. When he opened it, the ink had run in places, but the words were unmistakable. Names, transfers, signatures, a list of promises made and broken. "He knew," Oliver said, hollow. "He knew and did nothing." Father Hale approached slowly, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Then you must do something now. The past cannot be undone, but its silence can be broken." And just then, in that heavy, haunted room, a sudden gust of wind pushed the windows inward. The fire bent low as if bowing to some ancient judgment. Outside, the old church bell tolled, not for the hour, but as if echoing the reckoning that had finally arrived. In the house of stolen charity and quiet deaths, justice had begun to speak. The silence that fell upon the drawing-room of Dunmere Hall after Elira Dawn's bitter truth was not the ordinary hush of awkwardness or fear. It was something far older, deeper, like the hush of a cathedral where sins hung in the air like incense, thick and suffocating. The fire crackled mournfully in the hearth, casting shadows that danced over ancestral portraits now seeming to turn their gazes away in shame. Inspector Aldrich Dean stood motionless, one hand resting on the high back of a chair, his jaw tight with the knowledge that this case, once thought to be about a simple death, had widened into a moral chasm swallowing generations. Elias Hargrave, the elderly solicitor, had folded into himself, staring down at his wrinkled hands as though they alone held the weight of his complicity. "I could have stopped this years ago," he whispered, "but I feared what truth might do to men already broken by war." At that, Charles Wentham, a man whose lineage stretched back to baronial days and whose pride had never been bruised until now, turned from the hearth with the savagery of a man cornered by his own past. "What's the use digging this up?" he growled. "What's done is done. The war is gone, the men are buried, and dragging our name through the mud won't raise them." "Won't it?" Elira countered, rising slowly, her voice calm but thunderous in its restraint. "Wouldn't it at least say that their lives weren't just convenient sacrifices to preserve estates and surnames, that they mattered more than polished silver and family crests?" Her eyes, shining with rage too long held back, bored into him until he looked away. "My brother gasped for air in a ward too crowded to breathe. He waited for a bed at a place that existed only on paper. And you think memory is the burden? Father Lyle, who had been seated quietly beneath the shadowed arch of the mullioned windows, finally spoke, his voice low and sorrowful. When truth is buried for long, it festers. It does not disappear, it grows teeth. Inspector Dean stepped forward now, turning back to Elira, his voice careful, almost gentle. You stayed on, Miss Dawn, even after the betrayal, even after your brother's death. Why? Elira's hands were clenched, her nails digging into her palms, but her gaze never wavered. Because they feared what I knew, and I let them hire me as penance, as hush money. It gave me a way to survive, but when Mr. Godfrey returned and began digging up the past, when he said he would speak, right, confess, I knew someone wouldn't let that happen. Her voice cracked for just a moment, then steadied again. He didn't fall, he didn't slip, he was silenced. Sir Lionel, once so composed, now looked every year of his age, as though the very walls had leaned in to crush him. I meant to restore the funds, he murmured, voice barely audible. It wasn't theft, it was a temporary measure. We were bleeding, the land, the legacy, it was all on the brink. I thought we could fix it quietly. But time, Elira said with bitter clarity, wasn't a luxury those soldiers had. You bought silence with lives. A gust of wind howled against the windows then, like some ancient spirit enraged at its name finally being spoken. The fire guttered low, and Father Lyle rose, his figure silhouetted against the pale light of dying day. You see, my friends, he said softly, this isn't only about a stolen fund or a hidden ledger. This is about moral erosion, a quiet, polite rot that grew because it wore the mask of duty and desperation. But someone decided confession was too dangerous. Someone thought silence was safer than redemption. Inspector Dean's voice cut through the growing gloom like a blade. Godfrey Farrow was murdered. This is no longer only about what happened in the past. It's about who killed him to keep the past buried. And then came silence again, not gentle this time, but stark, accusatory. Outside, snow had begun to fall in heavy, whispering sheets, blanketing the estate in pale absolution. Inside, no one moved, no one dared breathe. Each soul weighed down by history, guilt, and the terrifying knowledge that the truth, long suppressed, was no longer a ghost. It had taken form, and it was demanding justice. After the grim revelations of the afternoon, the chapel stood cloaked in a reverent hush, its ancient stones steeped in the weight of newly unearthed sins. Father Merrin stood silently before the altar where Jonah Mallory's lifeless body had once lain, his fingers loosely interlocked behind his back, his eyes fixed not on the blood-stained tiles but on something far beyond them, as if contemplating the arithmetic of a crime that had masked vengeance as redemption. The late winter light filtering through the stained glass windows splintered across the nave in hues of crimson and gold, casting long broken shadows that danced with ghost-like grace across the cold stone floor. One by one the others entered behind him, not out of duty but from that human compulsion to return to the scene of tragedy, to look into the gaping mouth of death and demand answers. Inspector Alton Reed joined the priest's side, his notebook forgotten in his pocket, eyes narrowed not in suspicion but in the uneasy stillness of dawning clarity. You've studied this place longer than the rest of us, he said softly. Do you believe Jonah's death was truly a ritual act, or was it something more cold-blooded, something calculated? Father Merrin's gaze drifted from the altar to the old confessional box that loomed like a silent witness, then back again. I believe the ritual was real, he replied, but it was not for absolution, it was for concealment. Jonah was already dead when the symbols were placed. The bread and salt tokens of the old Sin-Eater law were not part of a ceremony, but a performance. The killer wanted us to see superstition, not motive. At the rear of the chapel, Marjorie Hensley stood stiffly near the doors, her gloved hands trembling, her jaw set with the brittle resolve of someone long burdened by a terrible secret. Then how was he killed? Asked Eleanor Ashe, the journalist whose pen now hovered just above her notepad, held like a dagger over paper. Father Merrin stepped forward, his hand tracing the curve of the altar rail where Jonah's body had been found in prayer. He was strangled, he said gently, but not by hands, not even a rope. It was a garrote, thin, sharp, fast, pulled from behind while Jonah knelt, his eyes closed, his soul at rest. There was no struggle, no scream. Death arrived in a whisper, not a cry. But who would do such a thing? Asked Colonel Hensley, Marjorie's husband, his voice hoarse with dread. And why bury it under folklore? The priest's voice darkened, because the killer knew this place, knew Jonah's habits, knew that if his body was found this way, with symbols from old songs and forgotten customs, it would deflect suspicion away from intent and toward myth. The killer didn't just want Jonah dead, they wanted his death to be misunderstood. The room tensed. Even the wind outside seemed to hush. Then Dr. Elias Trask, local historian and friend of Jonah, stepped forward, pale. He had been studying that old Welsh text, he murmured, the one on confession rites and moral burdens. He believed his family had benefited from something wicked. He meant to speak, didn't he? He did, said Father Merrin, and someone feared what that truth would unravel. He turned, slowly, his eyes sweeping the room. The killer wasn't hiding in shadows. They were here among us, listening to Jonah prepare to destroy a carefully preserved legacy. And so they acted, with precision, and with the chilling patience of someone who believed justice could be crafted by their own hands. His gaze landed on Marjorie, whose face had drained of all color, though her composure remained carved in stone. It wasn't anger, he said softly. It was grief, controlled, simmering, refined into a blade. The ritual wasn't just for deception, it was a message, a final meal served not to free the soul of the dead, but to burden the living with its weight. And as the sun dipped below the frosted horizon, casting long bars of dying light across the chapel floor, the silence that fell was no longer the silence of confusion, but the still, breathless moment before a soul confesses or a truth shatters everything. The drawing room of Ashcombe Hollow stood shrouded in an almost unnatural hush, as though the very air held its breath in anticipation of judgment, not handed down by courts but by the human heart itself, a silence so dense it swallowed the faint crackle of the fireplace, the soft ticking of the old brass clock, and even the nervous shift of polished shoes against Persian rug. Outside, the snow fell in fat, soundless flakes, muffling the world as if nature herself wished to draw a veil over what had just transpired. Inside, Eleanor Merton sat in the high-backed chair nearest the hearth, her figure as still as stone, the flickering firelight casting long, dancing shadows across her face, catching the glint of the steel handcuffs that now circled her wrists. But even they seemed less binding than the confession she had carried for decades, a slow poison that had burned silently through the lining of her soul. Her voice when she spoke was neither defiant nor remorseful, but strangely peaceful, like a woman who had wandered through years of fog and finally stepped into the bitter clarity of morning. He preached peace, she said, eyes fixed on the flame, with the same mouth that ordered war by omission. He let dozens die, my brother among them, not by blade or bullet but by silence. He denied them medicine, resources, rescue, all to protect his cousin's profits. And then he came here, to this village, to this chapel, with his cleansed hands and cleansed conscience, whispering forgiveness into the ears of children who would never understand what it meant to be sacrificed. The words landed like stones in water, their ripples disrupting the very fabric of the room. Inspector Alden, whose earlier movements had been precise, official, and measured, now stood frozen by the fire, not from duty but from the weight of understanding. Father Hale, standing nearby, leaned on his cane as if suddenly heavier with age, his wrinkled face illuminated not with condemnation, but with the sorrow of a man who had seen too often how grief reshapes morality into something unrecognizable. "Why now?" he asked softly, almost reverently. "Why cloak your pain in sacred rites?" Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the crucifix above the mantel, her eyes not pleading but weary. "Because silence breeds monsters, Father. I waited 31 years for him to confess, 31 years of watching him walk free, smile freely, worship freely, and I was the one imprisoned by memory, so I found the old rosary cord in my mother's things, the one she dropped while carrying my brother's bloodied boots into the cellar during the second wave of shelling. It was broken, frayed, useless for prayer, but it was enough. I knelt beside him in the chapel as he prayed, just like my brother had knelt beside wounded men in the snow, and I pulled that cord around his neck, not for revenge but for acknowledgement. For once in his life he couldn't silence what he'd done." Her voice cracked then, but the tears did not come. They had been shed in secret, in the small hours, in the decades of dreams shattered by battlefield screams. "I dressed the scene because I wanted it to confuse you, to make you look beyond blood and find what guilt really looks like, orderly, ritualized, hidden in robes. The bread and salt were for James, not to consume, to remember." No one spoke, not Inspector Alden, who finally lowered his notebook, not Septimus Crane, who stood in the corner trembling as if the air itself had turned to ice, not even Father Hale, whose lips moved in silent prayer as though words had abandoned him. At last, Inspector Alden stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "Eleanor Merton," he said, "I am arresting you for the murder of Reverend Francis Harrow, but I do so without satisfaction, and without peace." The cuffs clicked shut, not with the sound of justice but of mourning. As they turned to leave, Eleanor paused at the doorway, casting one final glance at the room she had once called home, a room now soaked in memory, judgment and the echoes of truth too long buried. Behind her the fire dimmed, as if it too could no longer bear to witness the slow corrosion of a good woman's soul in pursuit of a justice the world had long forgotten to deliver. The drawing room at Weescroft Hall had never known such stillness, not even during wartime blackouts or the long winters when death crept through the village like a patient thief. But tonight, that hush carried the scent of confession and the weight of a reckoning far deeper than any court could summon. Marianne Holloway sat alone in the fire's glow, wrists bound not just by steel but by memory, her figure upright with a strange composure that could only be born from years of suffering endured in silence. Across from her stood Father Alric, his small aging form wrapped in shadow, his eyes softened not by leniency but by the hard-earned empathy of a man who had seen too many souls driven to darkness by the failures of the righteous. "I did not kill him because he sinned," Marianne said quietly, her voice raw. "I killed him because he was preparing to apologize, to kneel before that altar and wash his hands clean with holy water, while my brother's bones lay crushed beneath foreign soil, never named, never buried, forgotten so he could thrive." She looked up, and her gaze held not hatred but something colder, resolution that had long turned to resignation. "He withheld medical shipments, Father. They called it logistics, but it was murder in slow motion, sanctioned by signatures. And when I begged for answers, they gave me prayers. When I screamed for truth, they offered silence." The rosary cord she had used still lay coiled on the table, frayed, faded, once sacred. "This," she said, nodding toward it, "belonged to Samuel. He gave it to me the night before he was deployed, said it would protect me. In the end, it became the only thing left that still remembered him." Inspector Dervin shifted uncomfortably, his pen frozen in mid-air, the script on his notepad interrupted by the unbearable intimacy of the moment. Sir Aldous Grentham, seated stiffly beside the fireplace, spoke for the first time in an hour, his voice brittle. "You knew about the misappropriated aid years ago. Why come here? Why work in this house?" Marianne smiled faintly, without warmth. "Because your father offered me the job, said it was charity. I think he suspected I knew. Maybe he hoped proximity would buy my silence. It did. For a time, until I saw the silver I polished at breakfast gleaming with the blood of boys who died waiting for morphine. Until I couldn't dust another portrait bought with grief." Father Alric stepped forward gently. "But why not expose him? Speak to the press, the police, the public." She turned toward him slowly. "Because grief does not shout, Father. It whispers in corridors no one enters. Who would have listened to the grieving sister of a nameless corporal when Lord Hewish was building libraries in his name? His sins were stitched into silk and philanthropy." There was a beat of silence. Then young Matthew Holloway, who had been silent at the room's edge, blurted, "But murder, surely murder makes you the villain." Marianne turned to him with tired eyes. "Then what do you call the man who condemned hundreds through silence and lived richly off their deaths? Is that not murder?" Her voice broke at last, the edge giving way to a tremor of tears long restrained. "I know what I've done. I know I've damned myself, but I did it for the ones the world never saw, for every soldier who died with an empty syringe and no name carved in stone." Inspector Dervin approached slowly, placing the cuffs back around her wrists, not with triumph but reverence, as though arresting a statue built from grief. Father Alric stepped forward and whispered, "You became a sin-bearer, not for redemption but for remembrance. You mistook vengeance for voice." As they led her away, the fire dimmed, casting long, uncertain shadows on the walls of a house that had hidden its guilt behind heirlooms. And though the case was closed, each person in that room would forever carry the unspoken question that Marianne's confession had left behind. When silence kills, is the voice that breaks it always a sin? She stood at the edge of the ancient chapel like a wound the world had forgotten to close, her silhouette etched against the amber light of votive candles that trembled in the breath of evening storms, and though her hands bore no blood, every tremor in her fingers spoke of a guilt older than the murder she had just confessed. The silence that followed her words felt too sacred to be shattered, yet she broke it with a voice low and unwavering, every syllable a blade honed on years of mourning and moral erosion. "He corrupted the ritual," she began, not with bitterness but with the hollow serenity of someone who has stepped beyond redemption. "He turned what was meant to be a gift for the forgotten dead into a shield for the living guilty." Her gaze lingered on the altar where the untouched bread and salt rested like relics awaiting judgment. "He copied the old verses from dusty books, but I learned them with my head in my grandmother's lap," her voice trembling with memory as she spoke of the senator, not a monster but a mourner, someone who bore the burden of others' sins so their souls could pass in peace. Her breath caught, but she pushed on. "But when Aldrin knelt with the right in hand, seeking release for crimes he never confessed aloud, for betrayals he buried beneath sermons and gold chalices, I couldn't let him be made clean. I could not take his sins into my body. I already carry the screams of my brother who died with his stomach empty and his faith shattered." Lightning cracked across the sky, throwing the stained glass into a frenzy of crimson and shadow, as Bishop Haldon stepped forward, his voice hoarse with the rust of suppressed conscience. "I knew," he said, eyes rimmed red. "I knew Aldrin was rerouting the aid convoys, and I feared the scandal more than I feared God." "I preached silence because truth was too costly. And so your silence fed the fire," she replied, still calm, still terrifying. "While mothers buried sons and widows wept prayers no one answered, you built walls of doctrine around your cowardice." From the pews, Captain Ray's jaw clenched. "But murder, surely you knew that justice through blood only creates more loss." She turned to him with the hollow eyes of someone who had tried every door before breaking the last one. When I first uncovered what he'd done, I fasted, I prayed, I wrote to officials, I begged elders. They closed their ears and called me bitter. My brother died a scapegoat, a discarded name beneath a shallow stone, and the man who orchestrated it all asked only for forgiveness, without cost, without consequence. She stepped forward, the sacred cord still coiled loosely in her palms, now an unholy relic. I waited until he began the rite. I watched him place the salt on his tongue, whispering words meant for the dead, and I saw peace coming to him like sunlight through rot. I couldn't let it happen. I couldn't let his last breath be comfort. Bishop Haldon fell to his knees, not in prayer but in collapse, his voice breaking like old glass. Then I failed you twice, once with my silence, and now again with my inaction. She didn't look at him. No, you only confirmed what I already knew, that justice, when denied too long, becomes a hunger that devours everything, even the soul. Elder Marilyn whispered, but what of your own redemption? Her smile was bitter, soft and final. Redemption isn't for those who trade peace for vengeance. I didn't want forgiveness, I wanted someone to feel what I felt, even if it meant losing everything that made me human. Outside, thunder groaned like the voice of a restless god as Captain Ray slowly approached, irons in his hand but no judgment in his eyes. You're under arrest, he said softly, but this story won't be buried. As they led her into the night, the chapel's candles flickered and died one by one, and though no one dared speak, all felt the chill of something eternal slipping from the room, some truth too painful to hold, yet too sacred to forget. And in the space left behind amid the storm and silence, a question lingered like incense in the bones of the church. When justice fails, and mercy is twisted by grief, who dares carry the weight of sin? Snow whispered beneath their boots like old secrets being stirred from slumber, and behind them the withered silhouette of Marrowshade Hall burned faintly golden against the bruised horizon, its windows flickering like weary eyes that had witnessed too many sins and not enough redemption. Yet as the carriage wheels creaked across the icy stones, there was a hush in the air that felt older than justice, heavier than grief, and deeper than any confession ever uttered within stone walls. Do you believe, she asked, her voice no louder than the breath that frosted in the air between them, that souls like mine can be forgiven, not by people but by whatever still watches from above? Father Calderon didn't answer at once. He looked past her, past the frost-bitten orchard, the broken sundial now buried beneath layers of white, and towards something unseen, then finally spoke with a quietness that trembled beneath its own weight. I believe forgiveness is real, he said, but I also believe it begins only when we admit that pretending to know the will of God is the gravest trespass of all. You did not just kill a man, Nora, you tried to rewrite heaven's balance sheet. Her eyes dropped and her hands, still stained by the memory of the silk cord she'd used, twitched with ghostly guilt. He stole everything from James, she said, not just the charity, not just his dignity, but the silence afterward. No one spoke, not the church, not the press, not even the graves. Father Calderon nodded, sorrow bleeding into the lines of his face. And you chose to be heard with a scream instead of a prayer. The wind picked up, scattering flakes across the footprints they left behind as the black carriage loomed in the courtyard like a closing door. Nora climbed inside without looking back, but as the driver cracked the reins, Calderon turned toward the manor once more. He thought of James, of the boy who had died forgotten, and the woman who had become a shadow of herself to speak for him. He thought of Aldrin's final breath choked on scripture and regret, and above all he thought of the ancient rite of the Senator, not as a relic, but as a mirror. Someone must always carry the sins no one else will touch. Marrowshade Hall faded behind them, but in his heart Calderon knew the story wasn't over. Evil does not die with confession, and grief does not leave with justice. The next generation would walk these same corridors, ask the same questions, perhaps spill new blood in the name of old wounds. The snow would melt, then fall again, and still the house would watch, until someone learns that vengeance wears mercy's mask, and the line between savior and sinner is nothing more than snow on glass, sharp, fleeting, and always at risk of breaking.